Well, for a large proportion of ALF listeners, the idea of going to the Northern Territory and luring up some saltwater barra, that's what dreams are made out of. And you could be forgiven for thinking that the best time of year, or nearly the only time of year to do it, is during the runoff. But the truth is, NT barra fishing is a year-round thing. Granted, they don't get quite so active during the cooler months of the dry season. And of course, great swaths of the Northern Territory are inaccessible during the wet season. That leaves those transitional periods at either end of the wet season, and probably the one that's most famous, of course, is the runoff. That's when a lot of people, locals and visitors alike, hit the waterways where all those wetlands are draining after the wet season and bringing food down to wading barra in all those feeder creeks. It's the kind of stuff that gives keen lure fishers palpitations. But actually the fishing can even be better at the other end of the season, in the lead up to the runoff, the build-up period. And I suspect that's been a pretty well-guarded Northern Territory secret for, well, forever really. But slowly but surely, anglers are waking up and realising the potential of that build-up period, not just for numbers of fish, but quality of fish as well. Fish that are conditioning up for the spawn. They're shaking off the cooler conditions of the dry season. Their metabolism is starting to speed up. They're hungry, they're aggressive, and they are ready to take lures. They're not ready for spawning yet, so you're not going to be interrupting their spawn, but they are really starting to get serious about feeding and getting more active. And as I record this introduction, I'm conscious that we are a matter of weeks away from the start of the build-up period, so perfect timing to release this episode of the Australian Lure Fishing Podcast, which I don't mind admitting, as I was conducting the interview, had my mind and my imagination absolutely racing. So folks, let's get into Australian Lure Fishing Podcast episode number 682, right after our jingle.
This is the Australian Lure Fishing Podcast, where our mission is to help everyday sports fishers experience extraordinary lure fishing. If next level fishing is your dream, then let us provide the tools and information that will bring that dream to life. Tune in as our expert hosts chat with Australia's best anglers and share their tips for success. Then check out our website. It's one of Australia's largest and most popular online fishing resources. But right now, settle in to listen as ALF founder Greg Doc Lures Vinall delivers today's episode through the nerdy lens of a scientist, lure maker and sport fishing tragic.
Now, folks, it's been a little while since we've cast our attention towards Australia's top end, towards the Northern Territory, not for any particular reason, just the way it worked out. But today we're making amends for that. We're going to go up and we're going to have a close look at the Vic River. We're going to have a bit of a look at the Roper River as well. And to do that, we've brought on board gun NT fisher, Katherine-based man, Trent DeWeer. So Trent, welcome to the show, mate. It's been a long time coming and I'm really looking forward to the conversation.
Yeah, hi Greg, and g'day to all your listeners.
Great to have you on board, mate. I know you're going to share a wealth of knowledge with us. I know it's going to be a really enthralling episode and a very informative episode as well for our listeners who are interested in top-end barramundi fishing. But mate, let's just spend a little bit of time, first of all, getting to know you a little bit better, because we haven't spoken before this. So I'm interested to see what makes you tick. So, mate, you're based in Katherine. It means you've got access to, obviously, all the estuary systems there, some amazing barra fishing, jack fishing, thread fishing, all those sorts of things. You've got all the offshore stuff as well. But what do you like to chase when you're not chasing barra?
Yeah, mate, we're in the heart of what we call the Big Rivers region here in the Northern Territory. To my west, we have the Vic River. To the north, we have all of the Darwin coastal areas, the Daly. And then to our east, we have the Roper River. And then further to our east, we have the Gulf of Carpentaria, Barramundi or King Ash Bay. Look, my first and foremost passion is barramundi, just with the boof and the fight that you get from a barra, and then also trying to target them. One time you can absolutely nail them and you go back there on the same tides and the same conditions, and they're not a fish to be seen. So I absolutely love targeting barra, especially when you get a boof on the surface. That definitely, you ask what makes me tick, that's one of the things, is watching a fizzer get exploded on the surface of the water.
Yep.
But following that, I'm really finding a passion in reef fishing, blue water for nannies and those bigger goldies, and I do that quite often with a mate of mine to the south, Brad from Sturt Plains. We get out to King Ash Bay and absolutely love that. I do that with my brother and Brad quite a bit, and that's growing on me a hell of a lot, actually.
Yeah. And look, we had Brad on the show. Regular listeners will know we had Brad on the show quite recently talking about saddletail snapper in the King Ash Bay area. And I think for East Coast anglers, when we talk about reef fishing, the focus is all on the Great Barrier Reef, and West Coast anglers is all on Ningaloo. And a lot of people, in southern Australia probably don't realise the extent and the quality of reef fishing that's available at the top end.
100%, mate. Dundee is a really good one to the northwest of Katherine, and that is an untapped ground. It's got Darwin not far away, but the town of Dundee itself is exploding with growth, and that's purely because of the quality of reef fishing, and not just reef fishing, the sail fishing as well.
Yes.
That's available there. You can head out there, and there can be 20 or 30 boats launching at the same time there, but you all head in different directions. It's amazing to watch. You all head out at the same time, but within half an hour, you can't see another boat, and you've got the fishing grounds to yourself. Watch this space as far as Dundee's concerned for the reef fishing.
I think we might just keep that one a secret, mate, and not share it, eh?
That's the idea.
Yeah, excellent stuff. All right, hey, I can't imagine why you'd want to do this, but if you were to just head away and leave Katherine behind you for a week or so and head off on a fishing trip somewhere else in Australia, where would you like to spend a week and why?
Look, I really enjoy central New South Wales. I've got a great family friend down there in Port Stephen, and we quite often get down there and we go right out to the continental shelf and we chase big marlin, and then you can come and spend a day in there chasing lobsters around the rocky headlands, and then another day you head off chasing flatties up inside the estuaries. I love the variety down there, but I also love the weather. It's a nice welcome break from some of the NT heat that we get.
Yes.
And diving into the water when it's 10 to 15 degrees, chasing a lobby around is something that I really enjoy as well.
Yeah, it'd be refreshing for somebody who lives in the territory, mate.
It is, mate, and it's a whole different world. Yeah, just to see another boat not far from you and that sort of thing. We're so spoiled up here that you rarely see other people while you're fishing, especially in the big rivers region. It's a really spread out region, and then when you get into these more populated areas, it makes me feel a little uncomfortable when I see so many boats around you all doing the same thing you're doing.
Yeah. And look, I'm Cairns-based, and we jokingly here at times when we have glass out days, refer to the reef as the Great Barrier parking lot, and that's pretty much what it becomes on those calm days from 3 in the morning until about 9 in the morning. There's just this entourage of boats, all 6 lanes at the ramp, a chock-a-block, and everyone's headed out to the reefs. How lucky are we in Australia, though, mate, to have such a diversity, and places like central New South Wales where you can fish for marlin in the morning and come back and fish for bass in the afternoon and that kind of stuff, and the same sort of thing up where you are as well. We've just got such an amazing, a lot of opportunities, a lot of fisheries in Australia.
We're spoilt rotten, mate. There's no doubt about it.
Yeah, absolutely. Mate, you've caught lots of different species. It comes with the territory in your part of the world, but what's a species that's eluded you so far? What's something you'd like to catch before you kick off?
Murray cod.
Okay.
I've never done much Murray cod fishing before. It's always been on the list, and the more I look into the cod fishing, the more I see how similar it is to barra fishing in a way. And I've been watching a lot of stuff lately on the cod, and I'm really keen to get down there and smack a few of these ones, especially on the surface. Like I said before, there's something about luring a fish to the surface and getting them to buff or strike. That's something I'm really interested in, is the Murray cod.
Yes, it's about so much more than just catching the fish. It's about that visual aspect. It's about the fooling them, the suckering them into coming all the way up to the top and swallowing something off the surface in a spectacular fashion.
You've done your job, your research you've put in and the effort you've put in. You've ticked the boxes to make that fish think that what you're doing is real.
It is something it wants to eat, yeah. Yep. Cool stuff. And the other interesting thing and enthralling, I know I haven't done a lot of cod fishing myself. I've caught some smaller cod. I haven't got a big one under my belt yet either. But one of the things I guess that always makes me a little bit enthusiastic about cod fishing is the number of homegrown lures that are used. And it's an industry in itself because there's nothing like the Murray cod anywhere else in the world. And so the lures that are made in Australia by a cottage lure industry for targeting Murray cod and yellowbelly, I think they're just fantastic. It brings a whole new aspect to the sport.
Yeah, I agree, mate. It's one thing I've actually noticed here. Being where I am here in Katherine, we've got a very transient population. We have the RAF base just to the south of town, and we get a lot of raffies post in and out of here. The last couple of years, I've had a gentleman post here from Stitch Up Lures, who primarily does cod lures, but he's now switched them on to the barra, and we've been using them up here, and it's been great. He makes them in his front yard, and I just think that, like you say, it's one thing to be shown or teach yourself how to catch one, but to make the lure yourself and then get that strike, that's something definitely to be proud of.
Brings a whole new element to the sport. And it's interesting, I remember talking to Brad Smith several years ago now about fishing for mangrove jack down in the Tweed system, and he was talking about using smaller cod lures, but nonetheless cod lures, deep divers, hard-bodied timber lures for catching mangrove jack along the rock walls and that sort of thing in the Tweed. Yeah, they do have applications elsewhere, but yeah, it's amazing to see all the lures that are churned out, handmade lures that are churned out by Aussie anglers. Fantastic stuff.
Yeah, 100%. It's a cool industry to see.
Now, speaking of handmade things, mate, or at least things are a little bit different, you live in a part of the world where you can be a little bit isolated at times. You can't necessarily always get the bits and pieces that you might want. So tell us something that you have in your tackle box or in your boat or in your car, anywhere you've got a bit of a stash of fishing tackle. Tell us something you've got that the average angler probably wouldn't have amongst their fishing tackle.
Yeah, that's a good question. The problem with where we live is the wet season, where we get isolated quite easily. This year it happened quite a few times with the bridges and the railways getting washed out and that sort of thing. And for us, look, the main thing, like I have, but it's still accessible, but you've got to have, in my opinion, some smaller soft plastics that are going to suit what you're doing. Don't go anywhere without a set of E-Man 3-inch minnows.
Okay.
For me, that's my go-to initial lure. And if I don't have any of them, I'm pretty upset fellow initially.
Okay. And that's really interesting because I know, I've been living in Northern Australia now for 7 or 8 years, but having moved up here from southern states and a bit of a stint in southeast Queensland in between, the first thing I noticed is nobody carries small lures, right? Everything's 4 to 5 inches or bigger, none of the 2 or 3 inch stuff. So what is it about those 2 and 3 inch, or sort of the 3 and 4 inch soft plastics you're talking about? Why do you have those? What do you target with those?
My philosophy is big barra will always eat a small lure.
Yes.
Quite often you'll catch a 80, 90 centimetre fish that's throwing up prawns or anything that's no bigger than 3 inches.
Yeah.
And it just goes to show that, obviously, yes, using big lures to target big barra works. There's no doubt about that at all. But my thoughts are, if I can throw on a smaller soft plastic initially, 90% of the fish that are in that area are going to buff it, whether it's a big barra or a little barra.
Yeah.
And so it opens up my target window. If I was to rock up to, let's just say I'm out on the highway and I'm culvert fishing, and it's been a nice runoff and I've got heaps of water pumping under this road, and I throw on 160 mil soft plastic in this culvert. Well, 1 or 2 barra might buff that. I won't hook up on them. But if I throw on a 3-inch Z-Man and retrieve that through there, a 40 centimetre fish is going to hit it and a 90 centimetre fish is going to hit it, and I'll hook both of them generally.
Yes.
So it's just about opening up the bite window for me. Once I realised that what happened this year on the Vic, a great example of it was I constantly use a 3-inch Z-Man, and my old man was using a 6-inch Berkeley Shimmer Pro rig. And when we pulled up to this particular runoff, I was hooking a lot of fish, 60s and stuff like that, landing them. Dad was very persistent with his bigger lure, and he got a metre 6 from that gutter. And then from that point on, once I saw that those bigger fish were there feeding as well as the little ones, then we both threw on bigger plastics and started to target those bigger fish in that way. Yeah. But I like to start with that little one and work my way up once I realise there are bigger fish there.
Yeah, yeah. I think that's awesome, mate. That's a really good explanation and something that a lot of people probably should take into account when they start hitting river system looking for barra. It actually brings me back to a conversation I had with Jason Wilhelm years ago on the podcast where we were talking about impoundment barra fishing, and Jace said some similar things. And Jace's comment was big barra eat small lures, and 90% of his really big barra that came out of Mondrian and Awonga and places like that came on 100 millimetre, 110 millimetre lures, and often you would go up to 130 mil lure and the fish just wouldn't hit that, right? Or they were less consistent at hitting it. And this is in a system where where you find barra floating on the top sometimes because they've eaten a bony brim that's so big that they've choked on it, right? So they can't eat those big things. Yeah. But most of his fish came on small lures. So it doesn't surprise me that you're having that kind of success with the smaller lures. And I think it's a great strategy to find the fish first and then upsize if you've seen that there's plenty of bigger fish around and filter out the smaller fish that way.
Yeah, and the proof for me was I was fishing with a good mate of mine, Michael Lynch, we were down the road, we're fishing a runoff. He had a 65 mil squidgy on, and he got a metre 24 barra on that squidgy. Yep. 65 mil. Yes. When was the last time you picked up one that was 65 mil?
It's a brim lure.
I mean, you can imagine that thing. Yeah, and you imagine that thing inside the mouth of a metre 24 barra. And for me, I was just like, there's the proof right there that, look, start with the smaller stuff, and then if you want to target those bigger ones, throw on something bigger, but big barra will always eat a small lure.
Great advice there, mate. All right, let's move on. I want to talk about who you'd like to spend some time fishing with, mate. I know you get plenty of opportunity to fish with plenty of people that come up through your part of the world, but who's somebody you'd like to spend a day out in the water, chucking some lures at Barra, just having a great time and a bit of a conversation?
Yeah, mate, how do I put it? I'm not a competition fisherman or anything like that. Like, I go fishing, one, because it's good for my mental health, but I just believe also it's good for you in general just to go fishing. So I'm not super competitive or interested in any of the competition. So I did a trip this last year with Merv Hughes and Squizzy. Mate, that was one of the best trips I've ever had because they were so casual about their fishing. All they wanted to do was have a good time and just chill out. And that's the sort of thing that I like to do. And that's what I enjoy, is just to go out, have a laugh, catch a few fish without the pressure of it.
Yes.
I suppose one person that I'd always be interested in fishing with again is the big fella Merv, because it's such a good time with him.
Awesome stuff. Yeah, and look, fishing means so many things to so many people, and kudos to those guys that go out and fish tournaments and are really into that. It's not my scene either, I have to say, but I appreciate that those guys are pushing the limits. A lot of the tackle innovations and those sorts of things are coming from the tournament scene. A lot of the new techniques come from the tournament scene, and then they filter down to guys like you and I that just love to get out and have a recreational fish for our own personal well-being and enjoyment.
They're pioneers, mate.
Yeah,
there's no doubt about them. They definitely lead the way, and like you say, it filters down through us so that we can then enjoy fishing as well.
Absolutely, yeah. So look, it means different things to different people, but I think it's just generally overall it's beneficial no matter what it is that motivates you to fish. Good stuff. Mate, last of these getting to know you questions, and this one I'm really curious about. It's the one that I usually finish up with in this part of the interview, is about telling us your story about your favourite memory of catching a fish. Now, I know that you've caught a lot of barra out of both the Vic and the Roper rivers, mate, so it may be a tough call, but is there one particular fish that really stands out? It's just going to be indelibly burned in your memory, you'll never forget it?
Yeah, it's probably, look, there's several. It's very hard to pick from one. Probably watching my boy catch his first ever barramundi, hands-free from me. He casted it out, he retrieved it, and he wound it in. It was a 58-centimetre barra, but he was only 4 at the time, and that was a pretty proud day for me as a dad. And also I saw the spark in his eye that fishing does to you. It lights a fire in you, and now I'm stuck with him wanting to cast his rod and reel every afternoon in the driveway, which is great. And I've never forced fishing on him in any way at all. I've always asked, do you want to come? I'm going to do this. And I've let him make his own decisions, because the last thing I wanted to do is force it down his throat. Everything he's done is at his own decision. And even just today, driving to drop him off at school, he said, when are we going to go back to the culvert fishing, Dad? And I said, mate, that's the seasonal rain. And but watching him catch his first barra, mate, was a pretty memorable moment for me.
Awesome stuff, mate. Yeah, and look, you might be stuck with him practicing his casting in the driveway every night after school, but isn't that better than sitting on an Xbox or an iPad or something like that? It's fantastic to have kids that get that enthusiastic that they want to be outdoors doing stuff, hey?
Yeah, couldn't agree more. No, it's absolutely awesome that when we get home, he runs through his fishing rod, not for like you say, a controller of some sort.
Yeah, brilliant stuff. All right, mate, let's start to turn this conversation now to focusing on these two river systems that we're going to be talking about. So can you perhaps give us the kind of 33,000-foot aeroplane view of the Vic and Roper rivers? Tell us a little bit about the general river systems.
Yeah, absolutely. Obviously, picturing Katherine, we're pretty much central of the Northern Territory, a little bit to the north. But to our west, we have basically the biggest river system in the Northern Territory, which is the Vic River. One of the widest rivers, especially at the mouth. It can be up to 1 kilometre wide down towards the mouth. It's a big, shallow system. It starts way back near the WA border and winds its way towards Katherine, then kicks back off into the Gulf. It's a river system that over the years has just continually changes and impresses us as fishermen. As a fisherman, the first thing we don't want to see any flooding of homes and that sort of thing, but consistently good wet seasons with high river levels is what we like to see. And that's what the Vic's had over the last few years. It's definitely widened and new timbers dropped in there in all sorts of spots and created new hazards and new structure and new life for barramundi. And then off to our east, we have the Roper River, which starts at Matarang and winds its way across into the Gulf of Carpentaria. That river system is a lot deeper, a lot cleaner system. So up high in the freshwater section, there's quite deep channels and things like that where there's lots of timber, lots of structure, and it's deep, clean, green water. Really good fun to fish. And then once we head out to below what we call the Roper Bar, where we've got the saltwater interaction start, it's then Pandanus-y, paper bark, tidal, and then turns to the mangrovey stuff towards the mouth. And it's a deep, clean, green river. And then once we head towards the mouth, it gets a bit sandy and a bit shallowy, as they all do. But the Roper is a renowned big Barramundi river. So is the Vic, actually, not to take anything away from the Vic. But yeah, the Roper River has produced a hell of a lot of big fish in the last sort of 10 to 15 years.
Yeah, and I have to say, mate, I'm just salivating sitting here listening to those descriptions, right? Because it just, both of them sound like quite different, but also very much big Barramundi territory. And anytime you've got a big river system like the Vic, lots of shallow water and a bit of dirt, a bit of murky water, barra just thrive in that, right? And
they do, again, mate, 100%.
That deeper, clean water, that can be absolutely brilliant to fish as well, because you can see so much of what's going on in the water, of course, when you hook a fish or when you're tempting a fish. Mate, I love that you mentioned the floods, and I think it's important we go back to that because, like you say, we don't want to see people's houses washed away and that sort of thing, as we've seen in the past. Our entire ecosystems are dependent on those floods. So those floods drive the spawning of the barramundi, they drive the prawn runs, they drive everything in those ecosystems. So if you don't get those flood and drought cycles, then the whole ecology starts to collapse and you start to find that your fishery starts to implode as well. So really important that we get those. And I would imagine, as you've said, with the last couple of years, there's been some pretty good rains, pretty good wet seasons in that part of the world. So that bodes well for the barramundi fishing, and certainly there would have been some good spawning and good recruitment over the last couple of years. In the years to come, as those barramundi mature and turn into meteries, that system should be fishing extremely well.
Yeah, 100%, mate. And look, I've got some great sort of stats for you from the Vic. I'm part of the Katherine Game Fishing Club, and every May Day long weekend we hold we call it the Big Horse Barramundi Classic out at Timber Creek, which is on the Vic River.
Okay.
And I'll just give you listeners a bit of a sort of background on the Vic River, so if they're ever looking to go there, they know what to look for. So the Vic River, the Timber Creek is 3 hours to the west of Katherine. Now, that's a small township where there's hotels, there's a pub there, there's a small shop there, and there's campgrounds and stuff there. So if you're looking to fish the Vic River, where you need to base yourself is a place called Timber Creek, and it's about 10 minutes from the boat ramp at the Vic River. So if you're ever looking to head there, that's the spot you need to start. And so, yeah, back to the fishing club, we hold our Big Horse Barra comp out there at Timber Creek. And we get about sort of 300 competitors each year go out to that. This year was our 36th year.
Wow.
That's been running. So, yeah, it's been ticking along quite well. But I think it was about 2020, we got out of 300 competitors, I think it was 110 barra. 2021 was very similar, 120. 2022, not so good, I think 80-odd barra. 2023, we got 200 and something.
Yeah.
And so that was following a good wet season.
Yes.
This year, in 2024, we got 850 barramundi with only 280 competitors.
Wow.
That is 2 years in a row of consecutively good wet seasons. And that's 850 scoring fish. I was out there fishing it. I threw back 10 to 15 that weren't scoreable.
Yes.
And if you work that out across all the other boats and all the fish that were disqualified and all that, so it's well over 1,000 barramundi caught. And the proof is absolutely there of what consecutively good wet seasons do for our system. And as we said before, the last thing that we don't want to see flooding, we don't want to see damages and that, but just the good consistent river level rises is the absolute lifeblood. And that was never more obvious to me than checking those stats this year and going, wow, that shows exactly what a good wet season does.
Yeah, mate, that is fantastic. Thanks so much for sharing those numbers. That makes a really solid point. And we're talking about barra here, but Australian fish generally across the country, our native fish, all require these flood and drought cycles. And if you think inland, the damage that's been done by regulation of the Murray River system in terms of recruitment of cod and yellow belly and that sort of stuff, and imagine what the fishery would have been like if our rivers weren't regulated and so the floodplains flooded when they were supposed to and the fish could spawn. So there's a lot of argument for retaining that environmental flow, but particularly the flood flows are so important. And of course, as humans, we've now gone and built houses in a lot of the floodplains, and so nobody wants those flood flows, which makes it difficult for our fish. But anyway, let's not get too political here.
No, but I suppose touching on that too, though, mate, that's where those peak bodies are so good for us. In the Northern Territory, we have the Amateur Fishermen's Association of the NT, and all they do is fight for amateur fishermen and the great work that they do. And you see the direct result in the fish numbers that we catch. But let's not get too political, mate.
And of course, groups like Ozfish as well, doing some amazing stuff. There's a few around now that are doing that, and it really is good. And I also make the point, mate, that if it wasn't for fishermen, this is one of the important roles that anglers play, unwittingly in a lot of cases. It wasn't for the fact that there's this army of people out there that have the interests of the fish and the interests of the waterways at heart, because we've got a vested interest in that, then the politicians wouldn't have a lot of incentive to do anything to manage our ecosystems, right? You can lock things up in national parks.
We put a lot of pressure on them.
Yeah, that's right. And you can lock things up in national parks, but then you've got to manage those and maintain them, and that all costs money. But here you've got an army of people who are out on the water, they're seeing, they're understanding, they're learning about waterways, they're learning about ecosystems, and they're wanting to see fish managed well. It's a really important dynamic, or a really important part that we play. Anyway, let's get back to fishing, mate, because I think we may have labelled that point. Yeah, we're here to talk about how to catch barra. So you've already set the scene beautifully. We know that it's some brilliant fishing to be had. Talk to us a little bit about seasons, though, because it is very seasonal in your part of the world. There are times of the year through the wet season where you'll struggle to get in and out, and there are times of the year, obviously during the dry season, when the fishing might be a little tougher or it might be a little different. But walk us through the seasons and how they affect the fishing on both those river systems.
Yeah, absolutely. Starting with the Vic River, up until February, so January, February, and possibly into March, depending on the wet season, we don't even bother going fishing, really.
Yep.
January, February, March are our preparation times, time to check your gear, and it's also time to do what we call culvert fishing. We drive down the highways and we find culverts that are pumping, and you can catch barra underneath a lot of the highways around the place. So for the Vic River, we generally stay away from it, again, depending on the wet season, until March, where those rains stop becoming so consistent and you'll get afternoon storms, which will keep the floodplains topped up. So what we're looking for is January, February, really good monsoonal rains that fill up all those floodplains that allow bait to breed, birds to do their thing, barramundi to get up on the floodplains as well.
Yeah.
And then as those rains start to recede, we get what we call the runoff season, and that sort of starts, again, depending on the wet, but around that March, April is when it really fires into gear. And that's when the Vic River is a little different to the others because it doesn't fire for as long.
Okay.
So the Vic River, I suppose if you think about it, it's very rocky, hilly terrain. So the water only pulls in certain places and it doesn't pull for very long. Okay. So our runoff season out there is really short. You really have to be Johnny on the spot, where you get it within a 4-week period, you'll nail it. Anything outside of that, and you pretty much missed it.
Okay.
So the runoff season there is quite short, and you have to be right on the money with it. And then we move into the dry season where temperatures drop, which affects the water temperature, which then slows the fishing down. It doesn't stop, but it slows it down. And what we also get is a southeasterly that blows up. And now, although the Vic River is an inland waterway, it's quite wide, and you get a southeasterly that's blowing 20 to 30 k an hour, and you get a run-out tide or a run-in tide that's going against it, the water will stand up, and it's not very much fun. And on the other end of that, the type of fishing we do that time of year is trolling timber. And trolling timber comes with snags. And then when you get snagged and you are fighting a outgoing tide with a wind on your nose and you're with your family, it can be very testing.
Yep.
So, through the dry season, look, we go out there and we have a good time, but we don't fish too hard. It's more about camping and enjoying the beautiful weather. And then we get into what we call our shoulder season, which is now. So August, September is our shoulder season, where we start to have more hotter days than we do colder days. And then what that does is obviously lift the water temperature up. Those fish start to fire up again. The southeasterly drops off. We get the humidity coming back. And then we start to fish really hard in the Vic River, especially in the timber, trolling rock walls and timber and stuff like that. Really getting your lure trolling nice and slow through the timber is a great way to pick up barramundi during the build-up of the Vic River. And then, obviously, as soon as the rains arrive, once we start to get some good downpours, that water dirties up really quickly, and then it shuts down, and we do the whole cycle again.
Yep. Yep, and that's a great rundown, and exactly as I understood it. And of course, anyone who's into fishing knows all about the runoff, but nice to know that there's fishing through other parts of the season as well.
Yeah, some of the best fishing is done in the build-up, in my opinion. If you want numbers, the runoff is a time for numbers. You can pull up at a gutter and you can pull 30 fish off one gutter and then move on, but they might be 30, 60 centimetre fish or 20 centimetre fish. During the build-up, you can really target those 80, 90 to metre plus fish, depending on your technique. That's when you can target those bigger quality fish.
Yes, yeah. And I guess during the build-up, that's when the bigger quality fish are preparing to spawn, right? So they're starting to condition up. And as you mentioned, water temperatures start to increase. Now, for you or I, an air temperature increase of 1 or 2 degrees is nothing, right? We're warm-blooded and our bodies are regulating our internal temperature. For a barramundi or any other fish species, half a degree in temperature change, in temperature increases their metabolism, so they start to feed a little bit more and get a little bit more active. So when it starts coming up 1, 2, 3, 4 degrees over a short period of time, those fish are going to start to get hungry. Their metabolism rises, they need to eat. So that's the time to fish. Would I be right in saying that at that time of year, the quality fish are probably distributed through the river system, but I would imagine down towards the mouth would be the place to fish?
Yeah, the Vic River is a very difficult river.
Okay.
Basically, there's 2 types of fishermen that fish the Vic. We've got lure fishermen and then we've got live baiters.
Yes.
Live baiters generally can fish that system through any period of tide. They don't really worry about the water colour or the water clarity. They're just catching liveys and basically putting them straight back out where they caught the liveys on a few different holes and things like that. What us as lure fishermen look for is we want those neat tides on the Vic. So we want that little movement as possible that allows the water to clean up. The issue with the Vic River is we can't get clean water at the mouth. That we rarely ever see clean water at the mouth. And you're travelling 90 to 100 kilometres to get to the mouth if you want to travel that far. And I've been there 6 or 7 times and never seen the water clean.
Yes.
I think that what that does, though, in a good way for barramundi fishermen, is it allows those bigger fish to head to the mouth without being targeted by fishermen. So it gives those bigger fish that breeding time down there where nobody's humbugging them. It's not where they're getting 10 boats trolling over the top of them until they boof something. They're pretty much left alone. Rarely will you see a boat down the mouth of Timber Creek or Vic River, sorry. And the reason is basically, one, it's a hell of a big area. It's vastly unexplored as far as a fishing aspect goes. And also the water clarity is just not there to target those fish. So we fish 40 to 50 kilometres from the boat ramp downstream. Okay. After that, it dirties up pretty quick. You've got an opportunity there when those bigger fish, like you say, they're putting on condition, they're feeding well, they're getting ready for their breeding cycle, where you can target them in the timber and be quite successful with it.
Cool. Now, walk us through the tides again, mate. Now, you mentioned neap tides on the Vic River system. They're the times to fish. That's similar to where I fish here in Cairns. We like a bit of tidal movement, but the neaps are definitely on a lot of our systems here when you get a little bit cleaner water and where the tide's not running so hard that you've got the electric on spot like and you're getting washed downstream. But what does a neap tide look like in your part of the world? Because a neap tide in the Northern Territory is quite different to a neap tide, say, down in New South Wales or Victoria.
Yeah, so we get up to 7 metres of movement on our tides here, especially the Vic River. It's a very tidal influenced river and it'll have a tidal wall come up it quite often during the full moon and the new moon period.
Yep.
So if people are lure fishermen and they're keen to fish that system, you should be fishing it on the neap tide when it's, say, a 3.5 metre to a 4 metre movement.
Yep.
And what that allows is, as we spoke about, the sediment to drop out of the water, it cleans up. We don't want the neapest of neaps. We find that when it's super neap, that the old saying, no run, no fun, is quite true.
Yep.
And fishing either just before the neaps, across the neaps, towards the end of them is a good period. The fishing generally will slow down on those 3 tide days when there's not as much movement and pick up again the next day when it starts to run a bit more. And that water clarity will still stay clean for 2 or 3 days after that, the first quarter and the last quarter of the moon when we have our neap.
So that's the tides are just starting to build towards the full or the new. So the water's still clear, but you're starting to get that movement.
Yeah, and that run seems to definitely turn on those bigger fish.
Okay. Yeah. And how does that differ in the Roper?
Yeah, so the roper, it depends on your targeting down there. The roper is not like the Vic where we don't fish the mouth of the Vic. The roper, we target the mouth a lot. And the reason we can target the mouth of that river is it's a little bit more, I suppose, sandy than what the Vic is. The Vic's very red mud type of a river, and that makes it dirty all the time. Whereas the roper, we get those Nipa tides, the sediment does drop out, and you get a clean green line of water travelling right out into the Gulf of Carpentaria. And that gives you the ability to target those bigger fish at the mouth. Upstream of the mouth, you will get the water dirty up a bit on the bigger tides, but you can generally fish that most tides. And this time of year, it's really popular with cherepin fishermen. They'll catch a live cherepin and send it down into the timber and try and drag a fish out of there.
They love those.
Yeah, it is. They are two very different systems, really contrasting between them. And I suppose if people want to paint themselves a mental picture, you think of the Vic as escarpment country, red rock country, and then we've got the roper, which is flat black soil plateau plains with that cleaner, greener sort of system.
Some stuff. All right, mate. So tides, obviously, in your part of the world, they're the biggest driving factor, or tides and runoff, of course, rainfall. They're the two factors that you really have to take into consideration. But is there anything else in terms of weather conditions or cloud cover or wind?
Yeah, barometric pressure is a huge one. A lot of the boys who have put a lot of time into figuring out that sort of barometric pressure will know right before a low pressure system hits, they can have some of the best fishing in the build-up season. And look, I haven't tapped into that side of it yet. I speak to a few of my mates who are really keen and really interested in it. But one thing they look at a lot is the barometric pressure. Okay,
interesting. Yeah, and I think barometric pressure does play a big part in a lot of fishing, but maybe not for the reasons that some people think. And I've heard the opposite. Barra fishers talking about the opposite. Low pressure system, the swim bladder expands and the barra don't get hungry. And then others, particularly cod and mangrove jack and bass and barra fishers in other areas go, no, the low pressure, when there's a storm front coming and the air pressure drops, that's when they come on the juice. Love all of that. Really interesting stuff. Mate, I'd like to move now into just having a bit of a chat about tackle and preparing ourselves for a trip on either of these river systems. And presumably correct me if I'm wrong, but perhaps the general combos might be similar, but the lure selections might be different given dirty water and clean water systems. But just walk us through. We'll maybe start with the rods, reels, lines and leaders first, and then we'll talk about the lures a bit more later.
Yeah, cool. Initially, I suppose the first thing you have to think about when you're coming up to the NT is if you're going to live bait or lure fish. If you're going to live bait, generally people will run a spinning combo, a Shimano bait runner in a 4000 with a glass rod, where you can put it on bait runner mode and put it in the rod holder and let a mullet or let a cherepin do its thing. If you're a barra fisherman, we've touched on the jabbers rods and stuff before. They've really changed my fishing game where I no longer have any rods on the deck. They're all underneath my front hatch, and I have about 6 or 7 rods underneath my front hatch at any one time. I can just pick one and go for it. So having a range of rods gives you the ability to use different lures, and I suppose we'll touch on the lures soon, but as a minimum requirement, we run a 150 to 200 size bait caster. Anything, a dial attached to a 200, dial attached to a 150, a Shimano Corrado, something like that. Spooled with a good quality braid. 30 pound is where we generally run. So Daiwa are doing a really good braid called Expedition at the moment, and it's a lot thinner than anything on the market. So one thing we look at a lot is the capacity that we can get onto a bait cast reel. So some people will come in and ask for a 50-pound line on a bait cast reel, and look, I nod and say no worries, but I'm only going to get about 80 metres on it. Whereas with a good quality 30-pound line on the same reel, we can get up to 200 metres, which makes a big difference over a fishing season. One, through if you hook a decent fish and you're out in the open and you want to play it, or two, just over the period you're cutting the line away and you end up with not so much left on the spool.
The other thing, I guess, is if you are wanting to run those heavier lines, you might consider sizing your reel up, and then you've got the issues of the gear's heavier and more fatiguing to use.
Yeah, exactly. It sits in your hand a lot heavier during the day, and it can weigh down on you.
Absolutely. Yep. All right. Sorry, I cut you off there. Continue on, please.
No, all good. Yeah, that's our reel selection, basically, and then we're going to match that up with a rod. Now, again, the rods are so varied in each different targeted exercise. But if you want just a general all-round rod, that you want it to be, say, maybe a 6 to 8 kilo rated rod. About 6 foot to 6'6" is our sort of standard. Again, each person will be different because they might want a 7 foot for targeting different things. They might want a heavier rod for using the bigger plastics. But if we're just talking a general day-to-day fisherman, a 200 size reel with a 6 to 8 kilo rod, 6 foot, 6'6" is absolutely spot on. And then, basically from there, we need a leader as well. So we've got our 30 pound braid, and then we're running a 60 pound or a 55 pound monofilament leader.
Okay.
Fluorocarbon, if you want fluorocarbon. I don't use fluoro myself. I generally just upsize my leader depending on the conditions. And one thing we find out the Vic River is when this water in the build-up, it gets, as the fresh sort of works its way out of the system over the dry season, we get the tidal influence, obviously, that brings in a hell of a lot of salt water. And on all of our timber and our rocks, we get a lot of barnacle build-up. And 60 pound leader, you can do one run through timber, come back, and it's absolutely shredded. It's not a good way to fish, but sometimes we have to put on a 100 pound leader, not for breaking strength, purely for abrasion resistance through that barnacles, and that doesn't matter whether that's fluoro or monofilament. Some of the toughest leaders I've seen that just can't last a couple of troll runs through this stuff up here. It's a bit brutal on them.
pretty amazing.
So
stuff.
again, that's your standard Barramundi outfit: 30 pound braid, 55, 60 pound leader, and a good solid rod. And most of your listeners should know the difference between your glass and your graphite rods if they're going to start getting pretty serious about your fishing.
Yeah, let's delve into that a little bit more in just a moment, because I do want to flesh out a little bit more some of the rods and gear that you use there. Let's just focus on those Jabbers rods for a minute, because it caught my attention that you mentioned that they've been a game changer for you, because I'll be honest with you, I've started using Jabbers rods in the last 12 months or so, and they've changed my game as well for similar reasons. Love the idea that you can have 5 or 6, 7, 10 rods if you want, all below decks, right? They're not going to get trodden on. They're not going to get snapped off when you get washed under a mangrove tree while you're fighting a fish. They're safely there. You can leave them rigged up. But what we probably haven't told our listeners who aren't familiar with the Jabbers gear is that Jabbers rods are all travel rods. So they break down very compact. They're super light. They're a Toray graphite rod. So incredibly sensitive, and look, I just love them. And I know that you operate the tackle store in Katherine, Rod and Rifle. Is that have I got the name right?
Yeah, mate, Rod and Rifle, Tackle World here in Katherine. Yeah, we've family owned, mate. Been around since 1970. Been in my family for 38 years.
Wow. Yep.
Here in little old K-Town, and we service 20-odd thousand people in the Big Rivers region. Yeah. But flipping back onto those Jabbers rods, look, the driving force behind them for me has been Brad. It must have been 3 years ago, mate. He gave me a Jabbers rod, and he handed it to me in this case that was, 600 long, not even that. Yep. And he said, mate, this is the best barra rod you'll ever use. And I remember laughing at him. Yep. Because a multi-piece rod, as barra fishermen, we don't trust them. Yes. We just go, look, these aren't going to... And so... Look, I'll be honest, I put that thing in the shed and I didn't use it, maybe for a year or more, until I finally went, bugger it, I'm going to get this thing out. And this was about 3 years ago. And I started to use it, and I quickly realised how wrong I was and how good Isaac had made these rods, the quality of the joins. And if you know how to use a graphite rod and you know the limitations of a graphite rod, you cannot break these things. Yep. Again, the key is knowing the limitations of a graphite rod. But I started to stock them, and we started to move a few. And I remember my old man. He is an old school fisherman. He was going to Costa Rica, and Brad and I worked hard on him on taking these Jabbers rods over to have a crack at tarpon. And before all of that, he wouldn't use them because he just said, "You're handing me something that's going to break, mate. Yeah. Come on." Yep. Think about what you're doing. Anyway, he started to use them barra fishing, and same as me. He quickly realised the quality in the joins of these rods and just the convenience of travelling out fishing. 3 hours is a minimum travel time for us here in Katherine. Yes. The last thing I want is 7 or 8 rods in the front seat of my car with my passenger sitting there leaning on them, because that's what we have to do with our rods. We put them in our car. Yep. But with this, it gives the ability to throw them under your front deck with a case with your reels in it, and you don't even give them a second thought. So anyway, my old man was very insistent he wasn't going to use these, and quickly came around to it. He went over to Costa Rica with these things to fight tarpon, our 200-pound tarpon. Yes. He pulled it out over there, and the guides laughed at him, literally laughed at him, and
Yep.
said, "Mate, we're going to film this because it's going to be hilarious."
Yep.
And all of a sudden, he's hooked this 200-pound tarp on this Jabbers 4-piece travel rod,
Yep.
and the guides were quickly silent.
Yes, yeah,
Because,
and pulling
yeah.
their wallets out to place orders, no doubt.
Absolutely, and going, "What is this thing? Tell me more about it." All of a sudden, and they are. We're only on the cusp of what these rods are going to do for the fishing industry. In my 100% opinion, is sooner or later everyone's going to have one of these. Can't recommend them enough, especially the models. There's a model for everything.
Yeah.
If you want to do big, heavy, soft plastics with your live scope and that sort of thing, there's a rod there that you can pull your car out of the bog with. It's that stiff.
Yes,
But
yes.
some of them, that's what they want. And then you can flip back down to the urban beats where you can throw that 65 mil soft plastic,
100%.
but still have the balls in that rod to land a metre 10 barra on it. They've absolutely, opened my eyes and changed my opinion of multi-piece rods, that's for sure.
Yeah, 100%. And look, I was a bit the same. I came up in an era where a 2-piece rod, that was enough. There was already one place there where that rod could potentially break. You start going multi-piece, you're just asking for trouble. And so I was a little bit sceptical as well. And then when the first Jabbers rod I fished was the Urban Beats Deft Flicker. And so I pulled this thing out of its case and I went, it weighs nothing, right? If I don't hang on to this thing, the wind's going to blow it away, right? What can I do with this? And put it together and quickly came to the same conclusion as you did. And one of the things I love about it is that particular rod is a very fast action rod. And I was using it for skip casting plastics for jacks, right? And I traditionally had gone for a medium or medium fast rod just for that smoothness to be able to get the lure to skip. And I thought, it's going to be really hard to skip a lure with this rod. Well, it hasn't been hard to skip a lure, but the thing that's really impressed me is because it's such a fast action, even with the weedless lures that I'm using, my hook set rate is phenomenally high, right? So I was missing a lot of bites before and I'm going, okay, that's okay because it's a weedless plastic. You get more bites, but you miss more bites. Now what I'm finding is you get more bites, but you don't miss as many. So that's been a real eye-opener for me. Mate, let's just have a quick chat about, I don't want to dwell too long because I feel like everyone that asks me about fishing rods, I start ranting about Jabbers and I don't want to be that guy, but they really are that good.
I suppose just a quick touch on it though too is we stayed away from travel rods too for quite a while because if you had, say, a 3-piece rod and you broke the middle section, that rod was a write-off. There wasn't availability to grab a new section. But with these rods, I've got a tube here with every piece of every rod. So when you break one, bloody $70 or $80, and here you go, you're back into the game again.
Yeah, there's a new piece. Yeah, and if you're going on a big trip, you're going over to Costa Rica to target tarpon, then you take 2 tips because it doesn't cost that much to do it. Yeah, so that's fantastic. I do want to just talk, you mentioned a couple of times about understanding the limitations of carbon fibre of graphite rods. And I think that's an important thing to talk about. And there are people who I wouldn't recommend a Jabbers rod to because it's not the right rod for them, right? And they're probably a little bit rougher on rods than what they should be. Talk to us about your views on graphite versus fiberglass.
Yeah, so being in my industry, being in a fishing tackle store, you quickly start to read your customer and what you think that they may need. So you help them find what they need, but help them understand why these things have a limitation. A graphite rod, highly sensitive, casts further, everything about the rod is better. That thing, though, will break in the blink of an eye. It doesn't matter if it's a $50 graphite rod or a $500 graphite rod. If it's used incorrectly, if it's beaten up and then you load it up, if you're trying to rip a lure off a snag, whatever it might be, that thing is going to break no matter the quality of it because graphite rods are designed to load on a perfect sort of arc. And a perfect thing I do with people in the shop is I get them to stand there and I hold a graphite rod and I pull the tip down towards the ground, towards my feet. As I talk to them, I start to move the tip of the rod towards their feet. If they start to lift their arms up and allow that arc to move, then I know they're good for a graphite rod.
Yes.
If they lock themselves up and watch that rod bend towards their toes, that thing's going to explode.
Yes.
And there's no way that any rod of any quality will survive that if it's a graphite rod.
No.
Well, with that, then we push to our glass rods, which are durable. They can be bent in all sorts of different directions. An ugly stick, you can drag the thing behind your Toyota and then use it to catch a metre plus barra the next day. And that's fine because that's what some people need to use. And not everyone is that fisherman where, you know, they need the graphite rod and they need the sensitivity and that sort of thing. But every day, Joe Blow that just wants to go fishing, mate, 100% ugly stick. Here you go, mate. You won't break it. You'll have a good time. You'll land a good-sized fish if you decide that you want to take your fishing to your next level, then that's when we move to a graphite rod. And then that's when we have the conversation about understanding that, look, if you bend that thing in the incorrect arc, it's going to break on you. And it's not the rod's fault. It's unfortunately your fault. And that's a really difficult position that I get put in all the time as a retail operating a store here. Is someone will buy a graphite rod and not want any help or any talk about it. They'll bring it back a day later and it's broken in
this thing's rubbish. I used it once and it broke.
What happened, mate? Oh, I was just pulling my leader through and it broke. And you were pulling your leader through on an angle. Or I was just trying to get a snag off and I was just reefing the absolute hell out of it. So that's the thing is trying to get people to understand that these graphite rods are strong as all hell. They absolutely are bulletproof if you understand the limitations of them.
Yes, yeah. And high sticking is the thing. When you're playing a fish, that's the thing. People get excited. They lift the rod up high. Fiberglass rod, not a problem. It'll flex. It'll cushion all the blows. Graphite rod, it ain't going to do that, right? It's going to snap. And so,
100%, mate. And we see that a lot. We see that a lot with land-based fishermen because if you're standing toes to the water, hopefully there's no crocs around, and you've got yourself a barramundi, right? That barra can come no closer to you than the length of your rod.
Correct.
Because it's out in front of you. But what most people will do if they're fairly green to fishing is if I start to lift my rod tip up, hey, look, that barra's coming close to me.
Closer,
I'm quite excited here. I'm really excited. Hey, it's coming closer. It's coming closer. I'm not looking at my rod. All of a sudden, this thing looks like an octopus hook, and it's just bang. She's all over. One thing I like to tell people, if you're fishing on the bank, get the barra as close or the fish as close as you can to the bank, then point the rod at the fish and start walking backwards.
Yeah. You can't break a rod that way.
No, you can't. And that's just that education and that sort of thing with people. And they need to really realise that, these rods are strong but there's limitations.
You have to use them right. Yeah. And same thing if you hook a snag, by the way, point the rod at the snag. If you've got to bust it off, point the rod at the snag. You cannot break the rod. Exactly, mate. I guess the other thing to understand about graphite rods, the reason they are so good is that the action's so fast. The modulus is really high, so very stiff material, and they can make the walls on those blanks super thin. So the rod's super light, it's super responsive, it's super sensitive, but it's also brittle, right? So you hit that against the side of a boat, and it might seem okay at the time. A couple of days later, you hook a big fish. Where's it going to break? Right where you smacked against the railing on the boat or whatever. So being able to pack them 100%. Up, and there's lots of expensive 1 and 2 piece graphite rods on the market, but being able to take a jabber's rod, pack it in its little case, stick it under the deck where it's not going to get knocked around, it's only out when you're using it, really protects it from all of that. So anyway, we've talked plenty about rods, mate, but I was thrilled to hear you mention the jabber's rods because, like I say, I'm trying hard not to be that guy that keeps ramming it down people's throats, but until you try these things, you can't understand. Before we move on from that, one last thing I will say, you guys stock them at Rod and Rifle in Katherine, yes?
Yeah, we do, mate. Yeah, we stock the full range of the jabber's rods, and they're all available on our website and that sort of thing. And if anyone ever wants to talk about them and discuss the models available, I'm more than happy because I've got quite a few of the models myself. And working in a fishing shop, mate, selling fishing gear is such an easy thing for me because it's my passion.
Yes.
If anyone ever wants to chat fishing and gear, look us up.
Cool. My number where can we find you in Katherine, mate?
Yeah, we're at 14 2nd Street. Katherine's not a big town at all. We've got 2 sets of traffic lights, and we're behind McDonald's. You won't miss us.
Can't miss it. Yep, perfect. So call in if you're a local and you're looking for some good gear. Call in, or if you're passing through.
Even if you're passing through, mate, we've got a full range of camping gear, fishing gear, caravan accessories.
Yep.
We stock Yeti products. We've got rifles, guns, ammunition.
Yep.
We're a seasonal shop. So one section of the shop is absolutely pumping this time of year, and then the next section starts to kick off as the seasons change. So we make sure we're a one-stop shop where you can get pretty much 90% of everything you need.
Yeah, perfect. All right, Pat. Let's move on and actually get back to our conversation about fishing the Vic and Roper Rivers.
We got a bit sidetracked.
We get a bit sidetracked. I get a bit excited on some of this stuff, mate.
I love talking fishing, mate. Don't worry about that.
It really is good gear. All right, let's talk about lures, mate. And I guess what I normally try and do is limit people to 3 lures that they would take with them. If you were hitting the Vic River, if you're hitting the Roper River, and you're only allowed 3 lures, what would they be? Maybe we'll give you a little bit of latitude because we are talking about 2 systems here that are quite different, so the selections may be a bit different. But walk us through, mate. What are some lures that we should definitely have in our kit if we're visiting this part of the world?
Yeah, to 100% straight off the bat at the Vic River, you need a 10 plus classic.
Okay.
So Barra Classic, 120 mil long. They also do them in 160 mil. Those 160s are getting a bit rarer, but the 120 mil, 10 foot,
Yes.
they'll all have a little sticker on the packet, but a 10 foot in a green and red colour is absolute dynamite. I've done my own 2 colours for the Vic, particularly just through trial and error. I've found that a nice green lure with some red dots on it. So I've got one I call Bleeding Banana and one I call the Reaper.
Okay.
And they are like, so if you imagine a green banana with red dots down it, that's my Bleeding Banana.
Yep.
And then I've got a very similar one, green, but it's got red lines running down the side of it. And both of them are absolutely dynamite on the Vic River. Now, the reason I went straight to the 10 Plus Classic is that is more of a build-up lure, okay? So when we're trolling the timber, so this time of year when we're starting to get that seasonal change, we'll start trolling timber and rocks. And the reason we use a Classic is basically if it floats, it's a good start, because what we're going to do is we're going to troll along nice and slow. When we hit a bit of timber, we're going to drop our rod tip to the back of the boat, which allows that lure to float up over that bit of timber you just hit and then keep going.
Yes.
And so what we do quite often is we're knocking the boat in and out of gear, and we're trolling super slow through this timber, just down deep in it. And you've got to be on the ball, and that's where that graphite rod comes in so handy for you, because you can feel the timber, and then you'll feel that barra boof, and then you've got to have that reaction time to turn his head and get him out of that timber. Otherwise, he's going to bury you and he's going to break your line. And it all happens literally in the blink of an eye.
Split second. Yeah, and that's where a fast or very fast action rod is great, isn't it? Because you don't want a fish to be able to turn. You don't want him to be able to get his head down and get back into structure. Then you want as little movement in that rod tip as possible. You really want to be able to muscle them, because that first half a second to a second of the fight, that's where it's all won or lost.
Yeah, exactly. And I use the snake charmer for my trolling. And I can't rate that thing enough. I can really put some hurt on some fish really quickly and get their head turned. And yeah, back to the lures. So Classic in a 10 plus, in a green or red, Guns N' Roses is fine. You've got, Bleeding Banana and Reaper.
Yep.
The other thing I would 100% have on the
Actually,
River,
sorry, mate. I'm going to just cut you off there for a second. Just before we move on to another lure, I just want to explore the Classic a little bit more. There's a couple of things. One is I've heard, and maybe it's true, maybe it's not, but I've heard that if you get caught on either the Vic River or the Reaper River and you don't have either a Classic or a Gold Bomber in your kit, that you could get arrested. Is that true?
Yeah, there's certain rules that
illegal
apply,
not to have them. Right? So they're a very popular lure in the Northern Territory for a reason.
But that's a rule that we put in place for your own protection, your own safety, so that you can catch the fish.
Very good. No, seriously, what I did want to talk to you about was just a little bit about your trolling strategy. And maybe I've cut in too early here, because maybe the next lure is a trolling lure as well, and it might apply to both of them. But trolling with tide, trolling against the tide, what kinds of structure you're looking for, all those sorts of things for those who are maybe a bit new to the game and are feeling their way. What advice do you have on the strategy behind trolling?
Yeah, so really good question, Greg, because it's a funny one, the trolling situation on the Vic, okay? If I'm going against the tide, okay, let me take a step back. The first thing you need to do is have a Jabber's Quickie snap on the front of your lure, on the front of your leader, okay, which is a snap-on, snap-off. It's just a little pigtail where you just roll your lure on and you roll it off.
Okay.
It's a 5-second change time of a lure, okay? So when I'm running against the tide, right, I will have a 10 plus Classic on going against the tide. Now, the reason is the tide and the boat motion doesn't let my lure get down as deep. And then, so in a piece of timber that's 12 foot down or 10 foot down, my Classic running against the tide is going to be right there, boogieing on top of that timber or in that timber.
Yes.
When I turn to run with the tide, I'm going to not put the boat in gear so much. I'm going to be in and out of gear to keep my speed consistent, but I'm going to swap my lure to a 6 plus.
Okay.
The reason is if that timber, again, is at 10 foot and you're going with the tide and your boat's trolling at a standard troll speed, then all you're going to do is bury that 10 foot straight into that timber quicker than you can realise, and it's all over, you're snagged, and then you're fighting against the tide, against the wind, trying to get your lure out. I swap over to 6 footers.
Yep.
So that when I go with the tide, that 6 footer is actually probably running at 8 to 10 foot.
Yep.
And I'm not going to just drive it straight into the timber. I'm going to be sitting just above it and hit a few branches above it and hopefully lure that fish up out of that bit of timber.
Yeah, yeah. And by the way, ladies and gentlemen, the diving depths of these lures is also affected by the line and the leader you're using as well, right? So if you're having to switch over to a heavier leader because you've got lots of barnacles and that sort of thing, when you're going against the tide, the drag on that leader is going to lift the lure up a little bit. It's not going to dive as deep, and the opposite happens when you're running with the tide. So just be aware that just because it says on the packet 10 foot, that's not necessarily the depth that it's going to run. It really depends on a whole range of factors.
A lot of conditions determine that depth. Yep.
Yeah. Okay, cool. So your general strategy, though, when you leave the boat ramp for a session trolling on the Vic River, is it we're going to motor along this river, we're going to keep an eye on the side scan and find fish, and then we're going to go up and down a particular stretch of river where we've seen some fish, or how do you do it? Do you just troll along from the get-go and find fish?
The Vic River, one interesting thing about the Vic River is the sides give away nothing.
Yes.
So the bank of the river looks the same from the boat ramp all the way down to the mouth.
Yep.
It's a red, sort of muddy, salty side of the river.
Yes.
The only indication that you'll get that there's something in the water is maybe there's a bit of rock on the side of the river, and then, as we know, that rock probably travels down into the river. So that's one really obvious thing is as we leave the boat ramp, there's a rock bar 200 metres down from the boat ramp on the left-hand side, which we call last chance.
Right.
And obviously the reason is it's your last chance on the way home.
Yep,
I think I've seen more barra caught at last chance over a metre than anywhere else in that.
There you go. There you go.
It's amazing. We all head down the river looking for it, but sometimes it's best to stay at the boat ramp. But as far as the Vic goes, there's no indication of where the timber is. The timber is something that you need to find, like you say, with your side scan, putting in the hours on the river to find it. There's plenty of structure and things along. There's shallow points in the river. There's Sandy Island. There's Pelican Point, where you can clearly see where the water flows and where there would be a deep bank where the river may have deposited some timber.
Yes.
And so that sort of thing is really obvious. But the thing about the Vic River is because the banks are so loose and not cemented into place, every wet season it's pulling away those sharper bends. So there's a spot we call the Golden Mile, which is not a secret to anyone. It's just above Green Island. And over the last sort of 20 years, I reckon that bank's pushed back about 200 to 300 metres, maybe a maximum of 200 metres. It's pushed back in. And what that means is you can be trolling in the middle of the river at 12 foot deep and there's timber everywhere there.
Yes.
And then it's the same for the next 100 metres towards the bank, because over the years it's gouged away that bank and then it deposits the timber just inside the edge. And the Vic River doesn't give away much about where it is, but those steeper banks are where the water pumps along, and then so you can almost be guaranteed that if you troll those steeper banks, you're going to find some timber or some structure there. And most likely you're going to find a barra in them.
Cool. All right. Very good. I think we've got a pretty good picture there. Yep.
Yeah, so 10 plus plastic. The next thing I like to have there is a vibe. I'm quite fond of fish trap vibes or any of the brands. There's the Markies, there's lots of them. Jack will do a good vibe too. I like to use those on the rock. So sometimes if the trolling is not very productive, but you can see fish there, I haven't mastered the live scan yet. I haven't had the time and the effort to put into that yet. So I'm still pretty old school with my side scanning and that sort of thing, and I can spot fish quite easily on the side scan. And if I've trolled over them a couple of times and they're not feeding, I'll generally whip around, drop the electric, and I'll run a vibe over the top of their head. And 9 times out of 10, you can convert a couple of those fish with a vibe. I use the 95 mil in the fish trap. The reason I like the 95 mil and not the 110 is I feel like my drop time is longer, and 99% of the times when you're using a vibe, those fish will hit on the drop.
On the drop, yes.
So, you're basically throwing the vibe out, you're letting it hit the bottom, you're raising your rod tip up, and then you're letting that slack, and then you drop your rod tip, and then you let that lure pull the slack back down to the bottom, wind up the slack, you lift up, you do it again, you do it over and over.
Yes.
And 9 times out of 10, you'll see just your line, and if you've got a really good quality rod, like the jabbers, you'll feel just the slightest boof in the palm of your hand. You won't feel it on your rod tip because your line's slack.
Yes.
But again, this is all these little tiny things that accumulate together to make sure that you're not going to miss that fish. And the reason you'll feel it is the high sensitivity of that graphite, the quality of your braid. You won't really see much. You'll just see a little dook on your line, but soon as you see that, you reef it up, and generally you've got yourself a barra on with a vibe.
Yeah. And look, I've watched people doing this and watched them miss bites and not even know that they've missed what could be a meter barra for all they know. But
yeah, exactly.
It's one of those things where you really have to be mentally focused. And I guess the trolling is as well. A lot of people think of trolling as, you throw the lure out the back and then you open your tinny and you sit back and you pat the dog on the head as you motor up the river. And that can work. But really the type of fishing that you're talking about here, you've got to be focused, right? You're going to feel those bumps as your line hits the timber. You've got to be ready to drop that rod back and ready to hit a fish when it bites. Same thing with the vibes. You've got to be 100% focused, because I tell you, I did some stuff a little while back where I had some underwater footage of barra being fed in a hatchery. These are bigger brood stock barra, and they were dropping pieces of pilchard down, and I was watching these barra sucking in the pilchard. And I thought, you know what? I've got this great video. I'm going to slow it down and see if I can slow-mo this fish, right? And it was 30 frame per second video. In one frame, the piece of pilchard was in front of the barra. In the next frame, the piece of pilchard was gone. So in a 30th of a second, there was no blur, there was no movement, it was just gone. And I can tell you that they can spit them out just as fast, right? So if you're not watching while you're vibing, you've got a microsecond to strike. So any little sign, if you're not sure, strike, basically. And you'll be surprised how often you come up on a fish. But a fun way to fish, though.
Yeah, they test you as well, especially in windy conditions, because you're watching that belly of your line for any sign of movement, and you're trying to feel your rod for any sign of movement. And when it's windy and the tide and that sort of thing, it can present a few more challenges for you.
It can be mentally exhausting. You can come home from a session like that, just bug it because you've been so focused and fixated on the line.
Exactly.
Mate,
can be very fruitful though, mate. Yeah.
Oh yeah, absolutely worth it, and a technique that every barra fisherman or every aspiring barra fisherman really needs to master. Mate, in terms of where you cast these things and that sort of thing, so obviously you're seeing the fish on your sounder. Vibes are notorious for being snaggy lures, so I'm assuming you're not throwing them in amongst heavy timber, but you're finding aggregations of fish that are sitting on a rock bar or over a patch of bottom. Are you spot locking downstream, casting the lure upstream and working it back with the current? Is that the strategy?
Yeah, it depends on each different little spot. A lot of the times I will be downstream of it and letting it come towards me, but that can present a few more challenges with the snagginess of it as well, because it'll drive that lure in it. And then if you do it upstream and it's flowing too hard, your lure really never makes it to the bottom. The belly of the line consistently pulls it back and it just doesn't work. I also pull out to the side of it sometimes. So I'll do a sideways sort of thing. I'll park parallel with it. I'll throw my lure upstream of it, and then I'll know that roughly where it is. I'll have a mental picture in my head about where the snag is, and I'll drop that vibe along it. But yeah, as you say, it's definitely not a timber expedition. It is a rock bar, back eddy, open country style thing, because those things with two trebles hanging underneath them, they disappear very quickly. Yeah,
it gets expensive when you leave a few of those hanging in the snag as well.
Yeah, it does, mate.
Good for a tackle shop owner, though.
Yeah, look, you guys use them on timber.
Yeah, that's right. All right, very good. Now, one last question on those vibes before we move on to whatever else you've got for us, mate. When you're lifting the rod before the drop, is that an aggressive lift, or do you just lift the rod enough that you can feel the lure working and vibrating and then drop it back down?
Yeah, it's not super aggressive. It's a controlled lift, a little bit quicker than what you would normally do it. And obviously you're looking. The reason is they're called a vibe because you want the thing to vibe as it comes up. Your rod tip should be shaking as you're lifting that thing up, and you're lifting it a metre or so up off the bottom, maybe a metre and a half, and letting it do its thing on the way back down. So, yeah, it's a controlled lift, not reefing it up, not being silly with it, because if you reef it up, you're going to get snagged up, or it's going to twist itself up on you. And sometimes with those vibes, they can hook through the loop of your knot or something silly like that, and you think you're doing the right thing, but and in actual fact, when you get it up, you're actually just tangled up. Yeah,
you've got no chance catching a fish, Yeah,
so more control is better.
So think of it as on the, and there's always exceptions. Sometimes a fish will hit it on the upstroke, but basically on the upstroke, you're trying to create vibration and lift the lure up where it's visible to attract the fish, and then you're expecting that on the drop as that lure, and good ones will vibrate on the way down as well. But you can't feel them because the line's slack, but as that lure starts to float back down, that's when the fish is going to hit it.
Yeah, I think that vibe on the way up gets their attention, and then because it drops so quick, when it does its thing, that just sparks something in the barra that's where he thinks he's going to miss it. So bang, it's just a reaction bite,
Barra get FOMO as well.
Yeah, exactly, mate.
Fear of missing out, All right, cool. Have we got another lure you want to talk about, mate?
Yeah, look, quickly, my third one would be a big weedless soft plastic.
Okay.
And now, so that's purely for when you're trolling the timber and you know you can see bait, you know you can see barra. Sometimes your classic won't get in there far enough. So you put on a nice big 6-inch weedless soft plastic, big weedless hook on it, and you send the thing down in there. I like to tuck my weedless hook into the back of the lure as well, which
Yes.
makes it even extra weedless. It
Yes.
does mean that you miss a few more hookups. You get that buff that maybe you didn't get because you're in that timber. You're right buried in where you should be.
Yes.
And yeah, you can get that. Can be quite a good way to fish as well through those. And the other thing is sometimes on those timber out the Vic, you can find a piece of timber that every troll run you're hooking a fish.
Yes.
And that becomes quite time consuming because you're hooking the fish, you're pulling out to the middle of the river.
Yes.
The one thing we do, as soon as we hook a fish, if I'm trolling, I turn straight to the middle of the river and I give the boat a little bit of power purely to get us out of the timber area. Because if you do get a good fish and you manage to turn his head, the first thing he's going to do is try and go back in there. But at least if you're heading out, obviously you're okay. But what that does is every 10 minutes, you're doing one troll over this timber where you're hooking fish consistently. Where if you go, bugger this, I'm going to put my electric down, I'm going to spot lock below this thing, and I'm going to throw soft plastic through it. You can hook a fish, bring it to the boat, unhook it, and throw it back out again within a couple of minutes. So it can be a lot more productive sometimes.
Yeah. Cool. Now, in terms of the soft plastics, mate, big 6-inch soft plastic, what are your preferences there? Paddle tails?
Yeah, I'm a big fan of paddle tails. There's so many good big brands on the market at the moment. Plastics seem to be just coming from everywhere. Every direction. I'm a real fan of the Caro soft plastic. They seem to last quite well. The Irukandji stuff, holds up quite well in those bigger sizes. As I mentioned before, I'm a huge fan of the Z-Man, the TPE material they use. It just never seems to rip or rarely rips. Yes. And these Ficaros and Irukandjis are very similar to that. And not only that, the pre-rigged Irukandjis have just good gear on them. So you're getting your good value for money there where your hooks are not going to straighten and that sort of thing. So they're a good one to look at in that sort of market. Yeah, super important. With the Z-Mans, mate, what are you rigging those on? I'm using with those 3-inch ones, I'm using a Jabber's Trio jig head in about a 14 gram. Okay, so exposed barb. Exposed barb on those ones, purely for the hookup rate. And a single hook, you can generally, once you get the art of undoing a snag without going over to it, you can flick them off. Yes. So you can feel what's timber and what's not. And without striking it, you can generally get those back off the bit of timber that you've just latched onto. Yes. The other thing I like about the Jabber stuff is the keeper on them. It doesn't allow the Z-Man to slide back. It's got a really big, aggressive sort of triangle-shaped keeper on it, and it doesn't allow the jig head, the soft plastic to slide off the jig head, which you do get a lot with other brands. I quite like them, and they seem to be strong and sharp, and they don't bend. They last quite a long time. Are they the bucket mouths, the jigs you're using, the Jabber's bucket mouths? Yeah, the bucket mouths are a bit bigger. Yeah, these ones are called a mandrill jig head. Oh, okay. Mandrill data jig head, and they go up to about a 7.0, I think, in them, and then they go to the bucket mouth. Yeah. So, yeah, like a 3.0s, 4.0s, 5.0s in those mandrill ones are quite a good jig head with an assist on it as well, an assist loop if you want it. Yeah, and I've actually got some of those sitting here on the desk in front of me that the boys sent me to have a look at, and I'm running a soft plastics course at the moment, so for those that are in the soft plastics boot camp, we'll have a look at those. I'll open them up and have a play with them during the course of the program. Very good. Let's have a look at the Roper river system now. So you've given us 3 good lures for the Vic. So we've got the Barra Classic 10 and 6 foot. We've got the soft vibes, and we've got the big paddle tails, soft plastics. Anything different we need to take with us on the Roper system, or is it the same lures, just fished differently? Nah, so the Roper's a different one again. So it depends on the time of the year, obviously. That's the main factor. But let's just put them both in the same time of year, and we'll say build up. And so those 3 lures I gave you for the Vic are for build up. And then if we were heading to the Roper in the build up, the first thing and the number one thing I would have, there's actually 2 I would have, is a Strata Terra 180. So that's a big hard body with 2 massive trebles on it. It's 180 mil long, and it's called a Strata. And what it is, about an 8-foot trolling lure. And they are, for trolling up those big barra, they are absolute dynamite. They have this nice big wobble to them, and with those 2 big hooks on them, when those fish hit them, 9 times out of 10, you'll have a really good hookup rate with them and a really good success at landing them. Okay. And so when you're using those sort of things, the main idea is at the Roper is that you're trolling from pretty much the mouth of the river, a few hundred metres inside the mouth of the river, all the way out the mouth up to 5 kilometres out.
Okay.
There's a channel that runs about 30, 40 foot deep in some spots. It seems funny trolling in that deeper water, but what you'll see is schools of fish in that channel. When the right part of the tide comes, they lift up and they come up to that 10-foot area to feed.
Yeah, okay.
And you don't get a huge window to hit them, but when they do feed there, it's not uncommon to get 5 or 6 fish over a metre in a session.
Wow. Yep.
And that's just trolling them up. So, again, some of the other fellows who are a bit more onto this live scoping and whatnot now, they pretty much park up in the middle of the troll run with their electric down, and all they do is stare at this thing and chuck lures at it until it bites.
Yep.
With the trolling, you get a bit of distance. And, again, like I said, my fishing's a bit more enjoyable. Don't have to catch fish. It's just more about trying to. Yeah, when you're trolling these big, long troll runs like that, you can, see a good part of the country and just see different things on your sounder, and you can watch the fish change. The one troll run, they're blended in with the bottom. The next troll run, they're maybe a metre up off the bottom. The next troll run, they're in the middle of the screen, and you know that, hang on, something's about to happen here. And, whatever part of that tide is, as long as you've got one of those big stratas on or a big B52, so in the reeds, very similar lure, the big B52, it's called a big ass 200. So now, we're talking 200 mil long, big barra lures. Those things for trolling in that sort of country for these big barra are just dynamite.
Yeah. Fantastic. So I found a lot of species, and this is the same with even brim and bass and jewfish down south. If you see them on the sounder down near the bottom, they may be feeding or they may not. But if you see them up off the bottom, and particularly if there's a current running, you see them up off the bottom, you know that they're off the bottom for a reason, right? Why would they be floating around mid-water? There's some bait there or something. There's a reason why they're up there. Generally, I know people that they're waiting for the fish to come up off the bottom. They'll motor over them. They'll mark them. They'll come back to them. No, they're still sitting on the bottom. They'll come back. And once they get up off the bottom, it's time to start fishing for them. So it sounds like it's the same sort of thing with the barra in this system.
It is 100%, mate. Very similar. And the good thing about the roper is that period of tide, when you work that out, it's generally the build up to the high tide.
Okay.
When that high tide goes slack, those fish feed for a little while, and then when it turns to run out, you'll get another hour each side of that. And then basically once the run starts, you'll see them drop back down.
Yes.
So the good thing about the roper is, you can do a couple of hours there, and now let's head back in the mouth and go up into some of these creeks or go and find a bank that's got some timber on it. And then what we like to use then is a Jackson suspending lure. So, about, 75, 80 mil long,
80
most of those.
Yep.
Nice big bib on them, and they're a suspending lure. So just for people who don't know what that is, they are, if you throw that on the surface of the lure, it'll drop down underneath the surface to, I don't know what they go to, about 6 or 7 foot or something, I think, and just sit there.
Yep.
What they give you is more time in the bite window. So if we were throwing a floating lure, we're retrieving it back out, and every time you stop winding, it starts floating. So with these jackals and these Jackson lures, is you can cast them out, let them sit in the timber or the rocks or whatever it might be, and just twitch them slowly through. And sometimes on that pause, where that lure's not floating up, it's just sitting, is when those barra will hit. So I really enjoy fishing with jackals and Jacksons. They're a great fun lure.
How long do you leave them sitting, mate? Because it's a bit different in impoundments, I know, but some of the impoundment guys, they'll pause for 15, 30, 40. Sometimes they'll pause for a minute and a half, and that lure will just be sitting there and they're just waiting. And it's the instant you twitch the lure that the fish hits it.
Yeah, I'm not a long pauser. Probably 5 seconds is the longest I'll do. My sort of mindset is that those fish that are in the saltwater system, they're so hyped up all the time. They're always worrying. They're always feeding, they're moving. They're worrying about predators. They're always fighting for their life, basically. They just make split-second decisions, whereas when I come back to, say, my river locally here, where those fish are buried in that timber and they might stay in that piece of timber for a week at a time because they don't have to move, that's when I could sit a lure there for a minute or two and say, here you go, mate, do you want it? I find those saltwater fish are that hyped up and that just all the time they're just looking for the next meal or looking for the next bit of cover. I just find that their reactions are a lot quicker.
Yeah. So I think for me anyway, in my mind, the advantage of the suspending lure is, if you think about how a bait fish moves for a system, it never moves in a straight line at constant speed, which is typically what our lures are doing if we're trolling them or slow rolling them. But as soon as you throw a bit of a pause in there, it looks like a bait fish that's unaware that it's in danger and it's just nonchalantly doing its thing, milling around, stopping here, moving there, and that's what attracts the fish. But I think the other thing is, and I've heard this analogy a few times, that I really like it, is that You watch a cat with a mouse, that cat's going to chase the mouse until the mouse stays still. And then the cat's going to sit there an inch from the mouse just waiting. And the instant that mouse moves, it's going to hit it. And I think sometimes barra do that as well.
Yeah, that's the perfect way to put it, mate, because that's exactly what happens. And the same can be said for using a surface lure, especially a fizzer. The old Bill's bugs, still the number one fizzer in my mind ever made. And sometimes you could pause them for 10 seconds. As soon as you go to move that thing, bang, it's an instant reaction. Yep. And sometimes even while it's just sitting there, they'll buff that thing up into the air. It's just some of the best fishing is surface stuff. Just a note on the suspending lures too is if you're going to troll them, make sure you're trolling them in an open country. Obviously, timber is not where you want to troll a suspending lure because once it hits something, it's never coming back out.
Yep. Great point. And, mate, that actually brings me to the final question I was going to ask you. And I could sit here for probably another 3 or 4 hours chatting with you. It's been an absolutely fascinating conversation and tons of great information shared, as I knew would be the case. But I am going to wrap it up. And the final question I wanted to ask you was about how you manage snags, right? So you've already said, if you're trolling, you're going to hit snags. It's a given. If you're casting, you're going to hit snags. That's a given as well. It happens. What's your strategy for recovering lures, mate?
Yeah, so the first thing I'll say is that if you're not hitting snags, then you're not in the right spot, really, for some of our timber. That's not true for other areas, especially where they're live scoping these fish in the open and that sort of thing. But in my country down here where I fish, the fish are generally found in the timber. So if you're not in the timber, then you're not playing the game, really. Yep. The main thing, mate, is there's 2 ways I get a lure out, or there's 3 ways, really. The first one is not recommended, but you can free spool your line. You can actually quickly grab your line and you can do the flick method. Even while the boat's still in motion heading, you can 40% of the time you might get that lure off just by flicking it.
Yep.
If that is unsuccessful, then I have 2 things. I have a top end of tackleback, which is on a rope. That's the first thing I use. It's a top end of tackleback, but I've also sticker-flexed some snapper sinkers to it.
Okay.
So that
extra weight.
When I send that thing down, mate, it's either going to break the bib of the lure off or it's going to break the timber, whichever's caught up. But yeah, no, I send that down because sometimes with the belly in the twine you use, it doesn't quite give it the punch you need. So yeah, I send that thing down, and if it doesn't work, mate, failing that, I've got a extendable pole which gives you that, I suppose, that rigidness of being able to actually feel the lure and knock it off.
Yeah. Yep.
And these things, in reality, they're inexpensive. A tackleback is like a top end of tackleback's like $15. Some Venetian blind cord is probably $10, and a hand reel is probably a couple of dollars. And altogether for $30, it only takes you to retrieve 2 classic barras, and you've saved yourself $30.
Yes.
I highly recommend people to invest in tackleback and lure retrieving poles, because it's once you learn the art of being able to do it. And it is an art because you need to park the boat beside it. If you don't have an electric motor, and let's just say you're fishing with your family and maybe your wife is not that keen on driving the boat, it all comes down to you to get that line right beside the boat where you need it, and you need that 10 to 15 second opportunity to do it. Yep. And it can become a challenge trying to knock those things off. But once you get it sorted, or if you've got someone on the boat who can drive and place you beside it, there's pretty much not many situations where you won't get your lure back.
Yes.
And even sometimes worth noting too that if you're trolling along, you may hit a bit of timber and bang, the line snaps, and that happens a lot. I always circle back and I wait a couple of minutes, because 9 times out of 10 that lure will float up. And what's happened is you've hit it on a piece of barnacle on your leader. The lure hasn't actually made it to the timber, so always wheel back around and have a look and see if it doesn't float back up for you.
Pick your lure back up. Great stuff.
There's one other rule I've got to tell you in the Vic River.
Yes.
If you see a lure on the side of the bank, you've got to go and get it, and you've got to tie it straight on.
So what's the logic, mate, behind having to go and pick the lure up off the bank? Tell me why that's
well. There's 2 thoughts. One, it's come out of a fish's mouth. Right. So they've hooked a fish on it and they've thrown it, so that's why it's floating.
Yep.
Or 2, it's been down in some timber where they've been fishing, catching fish with it. And look, it's a funny thing, but it works. You find a lure floating in the Vic River, you tie it on, you'll catch a fish.
There you go. Great stuff. Hey, Trent, it's been fantastic talking to you, mate. I've learned a ton of stuff. It's been a really entertaining conversation, and I really appreciate you coming on board and giving so much of your time and so much of your advice. And love to talk to you again another time about some other location or some other aspect of fishing in the NT, mate.
Yeah, thanks, mate. Look, I really appreciate the call, and if anyone's ever up in the Big Rivers region in the Katherine area, feel free to drop into our shop and say good day, and yeah, we can talk a bit of fishing.
Yeah, what days are you usually in the shop, mate?
7 days a week.
7
mate.
days a week. So if you want to go and talk to Trent, you've heard him on the show, you want a little bit of extra information and you want to find out what's going on, because it's all about recent intel. And if you go into a local tackle shop, these guys are talking to people all the time. They know what's biting where and how the rivers are fishing. Go in and have a chat to Trent before you hit the river. You'll be glad that you did. So, mate, once again, thank you for sharing your time and your knowledge, and we look forward to talking to you again in future. And in the meantime, tight lines and stay safe out on the water.
Thanks. Cheers, mate.
Thanks for listening to the Australian Lure Fishing Podcast. For free show notes, downloads, tools and resources, please visit our website on doclures.com or consider supporting the show by joining Team Doc Lures to receive exclusive members-only episodes, tools and resources. But for now, tight lines and may the fish be with you.